The Holy Gospel for this Trinity Sunday is taken from the 16th chapter of the Gospel according to St. John. These are the words of Jesus in the upper room on Maundy, Thursday, the night before he was crucified. And he said this to his disciples. He said, "I have many things to tell you, but you can't bear them right now. But when the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth, and he will tell you all that is to come. He will glorify me because he will take what is mine and declare it to you. All that the Father has is mine. That's why I tell you, the Spirit will take what is mine and declare it to you." Word of God, word of life. Please be seated. Of all the professors I had in seminary, my favorite and the one who impressed me the most was Dr. Won-Young Ji. Dr. Ji grew up in Korea back in the 1930s and 1940s in extreme poverty. He told his students more than once, "You guys really don't know what it is to be hungry." When he was 10, the Lutheran missionaries came to their little village, and his family heard the good news and they came to faith in Jesus, and that launched him on a remarkable journey. He was given the chance to go to high school there in Korea, and because he was such an exceptional student, he was brought over here to the U.S. and he earned his bachelor's degree and his master's degree and his PhD in theology. And he taught in Lutheran high schools and colleges. And then in the 1970s, he moved to Geneva, Switzerland with his family, and he served as the Asian director or Asian secretary for the Lutheran World Federation. And then in the 1980s, he came to Concordia Seminary in St. Louis to teach, which is where I had him as a professor. Well, I took several courses from him, and I was his student aide my last year in seminary in St. Louis, so I got to know him pretty well. And he was a brilliant man. He knew at least 6 languages well: Korean, of course, English, German, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. He was the general editor and translator for Luther's works into Korean. He wrote a devotional in German while he was in Geneva, and he wrote a weekly religion column for the largest newspaper in Seoul each week. He knew Christian theology inside and out, of course, but he was also very familiar with the Asian religions, with Buddhism, of course, but also Taoism and Confucianism and Hinduism. A brilliant man, but what impressed me most about him was not his brilliance, but his humility. Every day at the beginning of class, he would lead a small devotion. And at the beginning of the last session of each term, when we got to the end of the term, he would always do his final devotion for that term. And every time he prayed the same prayer. He prayed that we, his students, would forget everything that was just from him and remember everything that was from the Lord. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never had any other professor who prayed that we would forget what he or she said. Most of them think their words are golden, that they've fallen straight from heaven, that we should never forget them. But not Dr. G. He had the humility to know that the only real wisdom worth having is the wisdom that comes from Christ and not from him. Well, that has so impressed me that I have tried to model my teaching and preaching ministry after Dr. G. And so throughout the years, and especially when I leave each parish, I always pray that prayer. Lord, help them forget whatever I've said that's just me, my ideas, my insights, my thoughts, and help them to remember whatever I've said that is from you. Because our wisdom is not us, but Christ. I pray that people have forgotten, because as I look back, there are some things I have said in the past that I would never say today, or I would not say it in the same way. I am not the same person now that I was in my 30s. And the reason that it's different isn't because I've been trying to be relevant or keeping up with cultural trends. It's because I think I've grown in my faith and grown in a deeper understanding. Let me give you a couple of examples. I grew up in a very conservative Lutheran church body, and where I grew up, there were no feminine images for God. Everything we said about God was he, him, his. And it wasn't until I got out of seminary and had some pastoral colleagues who were female who began to push me and challenge me and to think more expansively about God. And they reminded me that God is not male or female, that God created human sexuality, but God is not defined by human sexuality. And so we can use masculine images like father, and we can use feminine images like mother to describe God as a personal God who loves us. One of the most profound feminine images is the one you just heard from Proverbs, God as Lady Wisdom. So that's one way I've changed and I think I've grown. Another has to do with human sexuality. Again, in the church body in which I grew up, there was no talk of blessing same-gender relationships or ordaining the people within them. And it was only after, again, I got out of seminary and began thinking and talking and praying with family and colleagues and friends that my thinking changed. And it took me a long time to get from where I was to where I am today. But it's been a good journey because I think it's given me a better understanding not only of God, but of God's love. And the other thing has to do with how we live out our lives together as community here in America. There was a time when I didn't realize that not everybody has had the same experience as I have had in America. That to be sure, we are all created equal, but not all of us have been treated equal. And it took me a long time to figure that out and to realize that. But now that I know that, the question is, then how do we rectify that? How do we change that so we're not only created equal, but everyone is treated equal? So those are some of the ways in which I think I've grown or changed over the years. And I think perhaps, I pray, have gone deeper, and that's why I want people to forget some of the things I said once upon a time. Now, over these last several years, I have preached on some of the hot button topics today, on masks and vaccines. I've preached on the murder of George Floyd and its aftermath, on gun violence in our country, on our political divisions, all those things and more. And the reason that I've done that is not that I'm trying to be political or being relevant. In fact, I've tried very hard not to preach politics. And what I mean by that is I have never, ever endorsed a particular person or platform or party or policy. I've never told anybody how to vote. That's for you to decide. What I have tried very hard to do is preach Christian social ethics. As a church, we have this long and rich tradition of social ethics, and social ethics talk about how we ought to live together as a people in our families, in our churches, in our schools, in our communities, as a nation and as a world. And so I've tried to ask, what does our ethical tradition as Christians have to say about the things that confront us today? And if I didn't do that, I think it would be dereliction of duty on my part. I would not do what I promised to do at my ordination, which is to preach and teach the gospel in all its fullness. But I don't have a corner on the wisdom market. I don't have this all figured out. These things are very multi-layered and complex. And so I have a hunch, just a lurking suspicion, that over these last several years, there may have been times when I said something and you thought, well, I don't agree with that. In fact, I think that's a bunch of hooey. And that's fine. You are not the first person to ever think that, okay? I've been married for almost 44 years, and I can tell you, Cynthia's not always said, oh, everything you say, dear, is wonderful. I agree with every word that's dropped out of your mouth, okay? This is not a new experience for me to have people disagree, right? In fact, I'm glad you do. I would much rather have you disagree and think through and work on these things than to preach sermons that are just pious platitudes that put people to sleep. I want you to think and think hard about how we live together as a people and become God's beloved community. God gave us a mind and he told us to love him with our minds. And I think that challenge faces us in so many ways today. And so I would like to think that I am a pastor and we are a community that doesn't insist that everybody agree with me. That to be a part of this community, you have to agree with everything the pastor says. Because that's not true. And in fact, those kind of communities where you have to agree with the leader or the leadership on everything, those are unhealthy communities. The healthy ones are the ones in which there's room for disagreement and dissent, for challenge and questioning. Now, of course, we have to do that in love, because if we don't do it in love, then it usually just turns into a shouting match. And we have plenty of that in America as it is, and we don't need to add to that. But the other reason is that the real question is not, do you agree with me or do I agree with you? The real question is, do we agree with Jesus? Because the church is not the fellowship of the like-minded. The church is the fellowship of the Christ-minded. So the question we have to ask is, are we seeking the wisdom of Christ? Do we have the mind of Christ? Are we searching for his wisdom? Do we think the way Jesus thinks? Do we see the world through his eyes? Because it's his wisdom that's the wisdom we need, not yours or mine. So do we as a community, are we seeking his wisdom? When I was at Luther Seminary for a year, near the end of that year, it was probably May, in one of the classes I was in, Lauren Halverson came to talk to us. And he was at the time a retired professor at Luther Seminary, and he'd retired, and he and his wife were running a retreat center north of the Twin Cities. And he came kind of to give us advice about once you get out of seminary and start your work as pastor out in the parish, what are some of the things to do and not to do? And he said some very good things that day, but the thing I'll always remember most is he said to us, he said, when you are out in your parish and you get up every morning and you look yourself in the mirror, remind yourself that there's only one Messiah. And the good news is, it's not you. I'm not the Messiah, and neither are you. But we know the one who is, and it's his wisdom that we need. So I'm going to keep on praying Dr. G's prayer, and I invite you to do the same, because he, Jesus, is our wisdom, not you, and certainly not me.